I will offer support for this motion from our colleague. And I guess, though, before I get into this topic around TMX, I would just say that I will end up offering a friendly amendment to our colleague Charlie to have this study supersede all the current work of the committee for this reason, because clearly, there is still a lack of certainty and clarity on the government's requirements for it urging proponents to meet its goals on electricity decarbonization, even though, as you have all outlined numerous times, that Canada's grid is already almost 90% clean. And I think that if you had a chance to answer, you probably would have said that your proponents and your workers would have continued on that innovation, that even without the CERs, you probably would have hit 90% very rapidly. I'm going to take a gamble that that might have been your answer. Certainly welcome to you expand on that in your written submissions. But I would just say to all colleagues here, the reason that Charlie's motion must supersede our existing work is because this government has promised ITCs for a year and a half and has not delivered. Because those ITCs have been deployed in the United States for 3 years, because this federal government has talked a big game about caring about Canadian businesses, Canadian workers, Canadian taxpayers, and really said they want to compete with the United States. And of course, every single Canadian here knows that we cannot compete with the United States in a dollar-for-dollar subsidy race to the bottom of the barrel because it is not affordable. But what we can do is compete in every possible way that we can control our domestic policy, regulatory, and fiscal agenda. That means actually working with the private sector to establish realistic targets on realistic timelines that are affordable, that are economic, that are possible with current technology. It means caring about where the generation comes from and the supply chains of materials. It means thinking about Canadian energy security, affordability, reliability. It means contemplating national security on energy security. It means not putting the cart before the horse, which this government has clearly done, when it actually hasn't figured out how to, as all of you have called for in different ways, accelerate the generation of the recovery of resources that require them to meet their end game, and where that's all going to come from. We must contemplate that this work should be done by Canadian businesses, Canadian workers with Canadian technology and Canadian supply chains, Canadian products to protect Canadian security, to pursue energy security with North American partners and free and democratic allies around the world. This is what's also clear. There is no federal regulatory process right now, right? The cornerstone regulatory framework and initiative by this government was declared unconstitutional, largely unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of Canada 6 months ago, and they've done nothing. They've done nothing while the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister now talks a big game about how this summer she's going to suddenly accelerate major project approvals and back the private sector and other proponents to get things built. Well, 10 years of their actual track record and results shows that that's all false. And so we're actually sitting here with private sector proponents and developers asking for clarity and certainty on fiscal and regulatory regimes. And right now, it is completely broken. There is no certainty or clarity at all. That's a direct result of this Liberal government, but also in participation from NDP and Bloc anti-energy activists who got us here. But I'll digress on that, and I don't want to undermine the spirit of cooperation here with my colleague Charlie. What's actually at issue here is a federal government that pancakes and layers on anti-competitive policies, taxes, targets, and timelines that are detrimental to Canadians, to our standard of life, that undermine the potential for reliable, affordable, accessible fuel and power that are the absolute essentials to our everyday lives in this big, cold, developed, proud country, isn't it? So I am going to hope that our colleague will accept a friendly amendment to ensure that his motion will supersede all of the current work of this committee. And I hope that it will buy a little bit of time, although it's urgent, for the Liberals to actually listen to what the people here who generate, distribute, and provide on the front lines to Canadians who need their power, who need their services, who need their products and need their technologies. I hope this government will actually listen to what these candid truth tellers to policy and to power are saying about the grave risks to continuing going down this agenda that this government is imposing, even though it's also still fraught with a lack of certainty and clarity. And none of us should be participating in the charade of pretending that it isn't. Now to the point that my colleague has made. Conservatives, of course, opposed the purchase, the government purchase, by which we mean taxpayers' purchase, of the Trans Mountain expansion. There was a business case. Kinder Morgan believed there was a business case. The former federal Conservative government approved the Trans Mountain expansion. When this government came to office for political purposes and ideology only, they outright froze the regulatory process of all existing major resource and energy infrastructure and project applications. That was the beginning of driving out investment, of killing 300,000 oil and gas workers' jobs, of starting what is actually the consequences of a decade of these guys, of Canadian investment soaring in the U.S. and foreign and American investment collapsing in Canada, but what's worst of all, of Canadian investment collapsing in Canada. Because the collusion between big government and rent-seeking oligopolies always rips off taxpayers and always undermines the public interest. But our job here at this table is to protect it and to fight for it. So the truth is, of course, that of course there was a business case, because a private sector proponent wouldn't have spent hundreds of millions of dollars going through a regulatory process, after which it did get an approval to go ahead and build its interprovincial pipeline, which was in federal jurisdiction. But what happened was these guys came in, they froze the regulatory process all the time, writ large, and then they delayed and delayed and delayed, and then forced Kinder Morgan to go through another process that they made up on the fly, because, again, they actually didn't get C-69 out the door until years later, and then started applying new conditions, a new review, an entire new bureaucratic process to this private sector proponent in the project that already had been approved. Then they gave it the green stamp, the green light. Then what happened? Well, then the court ruled almost exactly the same thing that they had ruled in Go to the Gateway, that the Liberals failed in their Indigenous consultation because they, as many governments have done, failed to have a decision maker at the table and couldn't demonstrate that there was viable two-way back and forth consultation and accommodations between the parties. Let's just be clear here. None of that ever had to be delayed. The proponent already had the green light. The proponent already went through the most rigorous, scientific, evidence-based regulatory process by world-class experts, which is, by the way, Canada's track record, the reality of Canadian energy development in this country, in this world. They already got the green light. That's the problem. That is what started the flood and the cancellation and this charade that the Prime Minister perpetuates, that there isn't a business case for Canadian oil sands or Canadian natural gas or exports of LNG, even though, clearly the private sector proponents think they're a case, and also news to the Prime Minister, so do world allies around the world who are begging for Canadian resources and technologies, which would actually, by the way, help lower global emissions. So moving forward, then what happened was anti-energy politicians, public policymakers, and activists took on every possible tool they could to kill that approved pipeline, to be obstructionist, to stop them at every step, to keep it from getting built. What we found out in the process is that the federal government itself gave tax dollars to anti-energy protest groups to say, block TMX and shut it down. That's
brutal.
That's the truth. So this whole language around there isn't a business case, nobody wants to do this. No, this is the consequences of a government that has an agenda to actually expand and exert economic, command and control economic agenda, to pick winners and force losers, because that's what always happens when politicians and bureaucrats get involved in this kind of thing. The loss and the consequences are a travesty, a generational travesty for our country, a failure of Canada to stand with our allies, a failure after 10 years of securing Canadian energy self-sufficiency and energy security, a skyrocketing cost of living crisis that has been caused by this big government corporate oligopoly agenda. What Conservatives said was this: the federal government needs to declare the Trans Mountain expansion in the general advantage of Canada. That would allow the federal government to A, assert federal jurisdiction, which that project was with federal approval. We said immediately that the government had to immediately and urgently get Indigenous consultation right. They delayed, by the way, for 6 months before they even started it again. That's actually linked to the unilateral veto of the Northern Gateway pipeline that the Prime Minister made, again, for votes in BC, not based on science or evidence. He unilaterally reversed the approval of Northern Gateway, the only standalone private sector proposed export pipeline to a deep water port with a fast track to Asia, obviously that the former Conservative government had approved. The Northern Gateway wasn't just abandoned. The Prime Minister Trudeau had the option from that court decision, just like he took in TMX, to redo the Indigenous consultation, get it right. We would have had a fully functioning dedicated export pipeline operating. If that had happened efficiently, the private sector would have built it on their tab. That would have given generational and permanent benefits to Canada. We said that what the government had to do was assert federal jurisdiction, enforce the rule of law, uphold the successive court injunctions that were very reasonable. Just, Conservatives believe every Canadian has a right to protest, to demonstrate, to speak up, to speak out, and of course also on energy projects too. The court injunctions were very reasonable. They were like, stay 100 feet from the entrance, don't block the workers because this is a safety issue, yada, yada, yada. But we all watched in slow motion as these activists and politicians colluded to weaponize their bylaws, to undermine the concept of federal jurisdiction, to question the legitimacy of the approval and of this crucial energy infrastructure, and a government that deliberately dithered, delayed, and then finally, I guess, because exactly as my colleague MP Patzer has said, the truth is they've been talking out of both sides of their mouths the entire time, and what a tangled web we surely do weave when we first deceive. And this is the worst part. We're all sitting around here like, oh, it's shocking that now the tab is $34 billion when the private sector had a plan for $7.4 billion, would have been operational in 2019 on TMX. How has this happened? Well, this is what happens when governments get involved. Like, how on earth is that even a question? This happened because the government would not back their own decision, cause delays, uncertainty, chaos, funded opponents to the project they approved while pretending they didn't. This is a very deliberate agenda. It all comes from an actually anti-energy and anti-capitalist ideology. There is not a single reason why this government had to purchase TMX. All this government had to do was actually stand by the approval, assert federal jurisdiction, get that Indigenous consultation right, which they should have remedied by doing it in Northern Gateway, but they lost that opportunity. They should have been prepared to back Canada's reputation and our world-class regulatory expertise. They should have been prepared to back the private sector proponent after they gave them approval. They should have used every tool in their toolbox to open the path for the private sector to pay the bills, to make their investment, and to build their major project that would benefit all of Canada for generations to come, show Canada to be reliable with its allies, get better prices for Canadians. All the ways in which we all know, or are, I guess maybe only Conservatives know, that energy infrastructure, energy transportation is absolutely critical and it is absolutely critical to the everyday standard of living, quality of life of Canadians, and underpins the entire economy. So since the regulatory and fiscal approach of this government to the unrealistic targets and timelines they are trying to force on electricity generators, distributors, and providers, given that they have failed, they have promised and failed to implement the ITCs, given that they're still going back and forth on what the final versions of the CERs might look like, given the asinine exclusions of small and medium-sized Canadian builders and entrepreneurs and providers, given all actually the insane exclusions that has anything to do with energy development, oil and gas, from any of their programs that they claim to all be about innovation and technology, which actually is just all about taxpayers' dollars disappearing into the ether, instead of enabling and opening the road for the private sector proponents and experts and innovators and risk takers and entrepreneurs to actually be able to do the work that has built this country. Since after 9 long, excruciating, painful, harmful years, certainly for the people that I represent, and every Canadian whose livelihood, standard of living, and affordability depends on resource development in Canada, I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I hope they will be able to come back. I hope they will give extensive written submissions. I hope we can pull this out of the fire for the best interest of all of Canada. But this is why I will be supporting our colleague Charlie's motion. I would just offer, if he would accept it, a friendly amendment to insert the words that this study occur as soon as possible and supersede all other work of the committee, because we agree entirely that and actually, Charlie, thank you for finally telling the truth and admitting that not you. I mean, I know that you've always known it, so I just thank you, because it's these guys that are, talking with fork and tongue. Thank you for actually telling the truth, which is that the emissions cap is designed to be a production cap, which is designed to put Canadian energy businesses and workers out of jobs, which is intentionally designed to kill their development, their businesses, which is intentionally designed to unemploy the people, certainly that I represent in Northern Alberta, certainly that my colleague represents in Saskatchewan, and certainly the people that my colleague here from New Brunswick, because Atlantic Canadians, as you know, have worked with Albertans throughout our country to build our respective provinces to the benefit of this entire country. And if only this government would get out of their gatekeeping way and actually let Canada take the global critical minerals, LNG, oil and gas and natural gas leadership, oil of all kinds, and natural gas leadership role that we should be taking in this world. I think it is more important than ever that we have this discussion about how to reverse this poisonous, wrong-headed, big government, big company colluding agenda, get back to a place where a regulatory and fiscal regime actually attracts investment and enables private sector proponents to do the work on which they are experts, to be realistic about timelines, targets, and to deliver actual outcomes and objectives, not a bunch of rhetoric and virtue signaling baloney. Conservatives oppose the emissions cap because we know it is a cap on production and designed to put oil and gas workers and businesses out of work.
Ms. Stubbs,
So
I'll
I
ask
wanna
you to just hold for a
So
sec.
thank
We
you for
do
telling
have
the
a
truth on that. We'll support your motion.
we do have a point of order. I think you're done,
I was just
but we
trying
have
to
a point of order.
clarify because she was reading what she was going to add to it, but then I wasn't sure how much was being added out of that conversation. Because
So
I had to decide whether I'm going to support all of it. I'm not. I've been pretty reasonable here, but I did hear that this study occur as soon as possible. I was trying to write it and supersede all other work of the committee, and so does.
So
Is that the end of it, or did you have all the other stuff as well?
I think
tell us where you'd put
on
that in?
I think Mr. Angus is asking for clarification on what your amendment was, and we have other speakers on the list. So if you want to provide that clarification,
Chair, thank you. I can hear him.
Yeah.
Also, fair point to my colleague trying to intervene on what exactly I'm trying to accomplish here instead of my, my evidence-based tirade. So what I am suggesting to the member that we include is after the word "and," following his point about the emissions cap, we would wonder if he would accept the insertion of the sentence that this study occur as soon as possible and supersede all of the work of the committee.
Point of order.
And we agree entirely that the objective, at least at the back end of this, must be to make taxpayers whole.
thank you, Ms. Stubbs. Go ahead, Mr. McKinnon, on a point of order.
I believe the proper procedure would be for Ms. Stubbs to move a sub-amendment, and then we can vote on that. There is really no such thing as formally as a friendly amendment.
Yeah, so I do have a speaking. Thank you for your point of order.